Welcome all. In this video, we're going to be covering off how to deploy Tanzu Community Edition, TCE. More specifically, we're going to be going through how to deploy a TCE management cluster into Microsoft Azure. Now, not only will we be going through how to do that deployment, but we're also going to go into Microsoft Azure and we'll cover off everything that we need to do to configure Microsoft Azure for a TCE deployment. So that's going to involve capturing some information so we can feed that into the installer. We need to accept some base image licenses and we need to create an SSH key pair. All of that we're going to cover off. We're going to be basing all of this work on the TCE documentation. So I'll be taking you over to the documentation page shortly and showing you everything that we're going to be basing our work off. So at any time you can refer to that documentation and that's going to be in line with what we're doing today. And a lot of what we're going to be doing requires a Bootstrap client. Now, it might not be the correct terminology to use, but what I'm referring to is a client machine that has all of our tools and components so we can do a successful TCE deployment. So we're not going to be covering off how to create that client machine. If you don't have that, I've created a previous video on how to do that and I'll put a link in the description below, so make sure you have that and it's ready to go. If you don't, check out that video. It will explain how to create a Bootstrap client. Now, with all of that said, let's go jump into the documentation and then we can jump into the process of doing a TCE deployment. Okay, so we're on the VMware Tanzu Community Edition homepage. So I'm going to head over to the documentation and we're going to be basing our work today off version 0.12. And over on the left, we're going to scroll down to getting started and we're going to go to deploy managed clusters. So that's what we're doing today. The first thing that we're going to see is a little bit of information about how to get the Tanzu CLI working. Now, this is in essence the Bootstrap client, your client machine. Again, if you don't have this, if you haven't done it yet, take a look at my previous video. I explained how to set up a Bootstrap client. So we're going to skip this and scroll down a little bit. And what I'm looking for is deploy clusters. And we've got a few different options here. As we can see, we've got AWS, Azure, Docker, vSphere. What we're targeting is Azure today. Now, when we select it, we get instructions on how to do a TCE deployment to Azure. It's all step-by-step instructions with screenshots. It's very easy to follow, and this is going to be the basis of what we're doing today. If we just scroll up a little bit, there's another section that I want to highlight, and we're looking for the install and upgrade here on the left. And I'm just going to scroll down a little bit to Microsoft Azure, and then prepare to deploy a cluster to Azure. So what we have here is a number of steps that we need to take care of first. So we need to do a few things inside Azure. We need to capture some information because we need to feed that into our TCE deployment. And if we scroll down a little bit, we have to accept some base image licenses. This is important. If we don't do this, TCE will fail during the deployment phase. And if we just go a bit more further down, we're also going to create an SSH key pair. Now, it says it's optional, but for all intents and purposes, this is required. It is only optional if you already have a key pair ready to go. But we do need this for the installation. Again, just like the licenses above, if we don't do this correctly, the deployment will fail. So we're going to cover this off as well. Okay, so these were the main sections in the documentation that I wanted to call out. We're going to cover off everything in these two sections during our configuration and deployment. So with all of that done, let's get into the exciting part. Let's go start our configuration and then get into the deployment. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is the configuration inside Microsoft Azure. So from the home page here in our portal, let's head over to Azure Active Directory. And we need to capture our tenant ID. So I'm going to copy that. And I have a text file here, which has a few sections that we need to fill in. So the first is the tenant ID that I'm going to paste here. We'll use this later on during our deployment. The next piece of information that we need to do is we're going to have to get our application ID. So let's head back over here and let's go over to app registrations. And let's go to new registration. And let's create a new, let's give this a new name. So we'll go TCE YouTube Demo. And I will hit register. And what we're looking for now is the application client ID. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to take this back over to our text file and I will paste that in here. Okay, let's jump back over to here. Let's head over to home. Let's head over to subscriptions now. And we can go into the subscription that we're going to use. And I am going to copy the subscription ID. Going to paste that here. Jump back over it now and we'll go to access control IAM. And we're going to go and create a new role assignment. So I'll click on add role assignment. I'm going to select owner. Next. I'm going to select members. And we're going to type in TCE YouTube Demo. There it is. I'm going to select that. And we're going to go next and review and assign. Okay, we're going to head back over to home. We're going to go to Azure Active Directory. App registrations. And we're going to select the TCE YouTube demo that we just created. And we're going to head over to certificates and secrets. We're going to create a new client secret. I'm just going to give it a description now. So I'll go TCE secrets for YouTube demo. 6 months is okay. And we'll hit add. And we're going to copy the value that's come back here. Now, make note of this because you won't be able to get to it again once we move away from this screen. So I'm going to copy that. We'll paste it down here. And now we've got our 4 pieces of information that we need for our deployment. And we've completed everything that we needed to do inside the Azure portal. So the next step now is we need to accept some base image licenses. Now, we can do this on our local client PC if we've got the Azure CLI, but what I'm going to do while I'm here is I'm going to open up the Cloud Shell and we will accept the licenses from here. Now I'm just going to quickly jump back over to the documentation because we're going to run a couple commands, and these commands are listed here in the documentation under the accept the base image license. So we're going to be following this process here. So I'll just jump back over to the portal and I'll just type in AZ logon login service principal username. Now I'm just going to jump over to our text file, and we want our client ID for this. So we're going to copy that and we will paste that in here. Next is password. And once again, back over to our file, and the password is the secret. Copy that, paste that in. And lastly, tenant, and that is our tenant ID. Paste that in, hit enter, and if successful, we're signed in. Okay, now we can accept our licenses for our images. So AZ, VM, image, terms, accept, publisher, VMware Inc., offer, TKG -Cappy -plan, and we'll just jump back over to the documentation and we will copy out the image name here, and we're going to jump back over to the portal. We will place that in, and lastly we need the subscription. Jump back over to the text editor, grab the subscription ID, copy, paste that in, press enter, wait a moment, and that was successful now. And we need to do this one more time, so I'm just going to hit up, and I'm just going to modify the plan name. And I'm going to paste in a slightly different name for a slightly older version of an image. Now this is optional, however during the deployment you can select between different images. So by accepting this image as well, we have the option to deploy to different Ubuntu versions. Okay, so we're done now with the base image licenses, they're accepted. The last thing that we now need to do is create an SSH key pair. So we can do this by going over to the terminal in our client, and what we now do is we'll create an SSH key pair with SSH keygen -trsa -b 4096-c, and I'll just put in an email address, mark@vmware.com. I'm just going to accept the default parameters. Okay, I'm going to add my private key now to my SSH agent, so SSH-add SSH ID RSA. Okay, and now we need to capture our public key. So I'll cat.ssh ID RSA.pub, and I'm going to copy the public key. And I'm going to paste that into our text editor as well. This is very important that our public key is all on one line. So if you don't copy it correctly and it looks like it's on multiple lines, make sure you put your key all on one line. If you don't, the installation of TCE will fail, and you'll have to basically capture that again and clean it up and start a new deployment. Okay, so now we have all the information that we need to start the TCE deployment. So let's go back to our terminal now. Let's clear the screen, and we can now start the installation with the command Tanzu management cluster create --UI. This is going to take us to our web browser and to the Tanzu Community Edition installer. And what we have in front of us now is 4 different tiles for different services we can deploy TCE to. So we've got Docker, VMware vSphere, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft Azure. So let's go ahead and hit the deploy button for Microsoft Azure. And now the fun part starts. So we get to take all the information that we collected and start to input that in. So I'm going to go ahead back to our text file. I'm going to pull out some of that information. So the first one is the tenant ID. Next is the application client ID. We'll grab the subscription ID next. And we need our secret. Okay, we will select our Azure environment, which will be public cloud, and we'll hit connect. Now, if that works, we should be able to select the region. I'm going to select Australia Southeast. This is where we put our public key in. Now, we need to make sure that this public key is all on one line. So we need to be very careful with this key. So if it is on multiple lines, if it appears to be on multiple lines, you need to clean it up and make sure it's all on one line. If it's not on one line, there's a very good chance that your deployment will fail. You will need to go back, clean up everything, and do a redeploy if that's the case. So my key's all on one line, so I'm going to paste it in. While it does appear to be on different lines here, what we're going to do is I'm just going to hit back, and I'm just going to remove my email address at the very end of this public key. It's not required, and I have had a few issues in the past where I've left that in, so I'm just going to remove it. You shouldn't need to, but if you do have some issues during the deployment, consider doing the same thing. For the resource group, we're going to create a new resource group inside Azure. So I'm just going to hit create a new resource group. I'm going to give it a name. So we'll go TCE, actually we'll go RG for resource group, and then we'll go -TCE. Next, for the VNet settings, we're going to create a new VNet. Make sure the resource group that you just defined above is selected. For the VNet name, I will go VNet TCE YouTube demo. For the control plane subnet name, we'll go SNet TCE YouTube demo -CP for control plane. I'll copy that, and I'll use a similar name for the worker node subnet name, but I'll change CP to WRK. Now, you can leave your CIDR blocks as they are, but if you don't want them to conflict with anything that you've currently got, you can change it. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go 10.10.0016, and for the control plane and worker nodes, I will also modify that as well. So I'm going to go 10.10 as well here, and 10.10 here as well. So it'll be 10.10.1.0. I'll just click next. For the management cluster settings now, this is the plan that we want to deploy. So we can do development or production. Development is going to be one control plane, one worker node, versus 3 worker nodes for, sorry, 3 control plane nodes for production. So we'll just do development in this case. I will select for the instance type standard D2S v3. This is one of the smaller instance types we can select that is validated for TCE. For the management cluster name, we will go TCE Azure. For the worker node instance type, we will select exactly the same. So we'll select as previously, so standard D2S v3. I'll leave the machine health checks enabled. I will then just hit next. We don't need to define any metadata at this point, so we can hit next. The Kubernetes networking we can leave as is. This doesn't need to change, so we'll hit next. Identity management, this is where we can define LDAP or Active Directory integration, so we can be authenticated through, say, AD. We won't do this in this demo, so we'll just take that off, hit next. OS image. So we have 2 options here. We've got Ubuntu 18, Ubuntu 20. These correspond to the base image licenses that we had to accept in the previous section. I'm going to select Ubuntu 18. I've had good success with Ubuntu 18. I've had a few failures with Ubuntu 20. So again, based on my personal experience, I'm going to stick with Ubuntu 18. We'll hit next. We'll review our configuration. So this is where you can just review to make sure that you got all your settings correct. And if you scroll all the way down, we can see our CLI command equivalent. So we can copy this and we can save it for later use if we want to use it. So we can just paste this here, and if need be, we'll refer to it later. But if we come back over to our installation here, we can just hit deploy management cluster and start the deployment. So that's what we're going to do. So let's go ahead and hit deploy management cluster. And now our installation will begin. So this will take about 20 to 30 minutes. It can vary a little bit as we're pushing this up to Azure, and it really just depends a bit on the load at any given moment. So we'll let this run, and we'll be back. Well, I'll be back in about 20 to 30 minutes, but for you, it should hopefully just be a few seconds. I'll fast forward this section. And we're back. That was a bit of a nervous wait, but it looks like we have a successful deployment of TCE on Microsoft Azure, which is awesome. Now, the last part of this is to verify that we can actually see and connect to our management cluster. So let's quickly go ahead and do that, and we can wrap up this video. So let's go to our terminal. We can see that our management cluster has been created here. So we'll type in Tanzu login, and we will select our cluster, so TCE Azure. And now we'll type in Tanzu management cluster get, and we get a little bit of information on our cluster. So we can see our name is TCE Azure. It's running with 1 control plane, 1 worker node. Our role is management, and our plan is dev. So that's a good start. And now let's see if we can use kube control and connect to our cluster. So to do that, we can go Tanzu management cluster kube config get --admin, and now we will type in kube control config use context, and I'm just going to copy this. And finally, Control, get nodes. And there we go. I can see my 2 nodes running in Azure. We can also go Control, get pods, and we can see everything that's running. So this is a pretty good sign. I'm pretty happy with this. And one last thing, if we want, we can jump back over to the Azure portal, jump back to the home. I will have a look in the resource group that we created, so RGTCE. And we can see all of our resources that have been created. So I'm pretty happy with that. How cool is that? So we have a successful deployment. So that's it, guys. Thank you for hanging around to the end. This was a bit of a long video, I know. There is actually a lot to cover to get a TCE deployment to happen, particularly in a public cloud like Microsoft Azure. So it's not quite the 5 minutes that some people say, but it still is fairly quick. So thank you for hanging around to the end, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.